The VisionSpring story started in a very unusual place. It started in the northern mountains of the Brooks Range in Alaska. So this picture is taken above the Arctic Circle in Alaska. One of the things that I loved to do prior to starting my organization was climbing and mountaineering. And I'd find myself in the middle of nowhere in the world as a young man. I was in my early 20s when I was up in the Brooks Range. And as we were about halfway into our 3-week trek in this area, a huge rainstorm swept in, and it was the kind of rain that was horizontal rain. And it lasted for 3 days. The first 2 days, we just went to the tent because it was so miserable. It was like 38 degrees and just driving rain. The third day, I was like, enough is enough. I have to get out of this tent. And so I told my two friends, I'm going to go climb one of those hills that you see, and if I'm not back in 8 hours, come and get me, because it was grizzly bear territory, and I was afraid that I might meet up with a grizzly bear. So I went and I climbed up on the mountain, and there I was in this vast wilderness. The wind was pelting my face, the rain was pelting my face, and it felt like the whole world was conspiring against me, telling me that I was insignificant. And it was really one of those, as they say, dust in the wind moments, where you feel like there's no purpose to your life. And that was the message that I was getting. But as a young, energetic person, I really hated that message. And I remember literally screaming back into the wind, insisting that I did matter. But if the truth be told, deep in my bones, I really didn't know why or how. And that was the first time where I really had a stark yearning for figuring out, what does a life worth living mean? How can we flourish in a life so when we look back, we feel like we've given something back rather than just taken from the world? Fast forward 6 months, I was a student studying to be an eye doctor, and I found out about an organization that brought eye care services to underserved markets in the developing world. And my first trip was to rural Mexico. Our bus rolled up to the temporary clinic where we were setting up shop, and there was a line of over 2,000 people wrapping around the building. It was almost like we were selling iPhones or something like that. It was quite amazing to see. It was very stark that clearly there was a huge need for eye care services. I took my station, and the very first patient who I saw was a 7-year-old boy. But what made him remarkable, this is not his actual picture, this is just a picture of a 7-year-old boy or so. What made him remarkable was that he was from the School for the Blind. And I took a look at his eyes, and I realized that this boy wasn't blind. He was just profoundly nearsighted. And he needed a really, really strong pair of glasses. He needed a -20 prescription, which basically meant that if he could see my hand waving in front of his eyes, but he couldn't even see how many fingers I held up. I was instructed by my professor to go to the strongest box of glasses. We bought down 5,000 pair of glasses and see if anything was close to his prescription. And sure enough, there was a pair of glasses, -18. And I was the lucky person to put those glasses on that boy's face. And when the lenses lined up with his eyes, this blank stare of a blind child transformed into this incredible universal smile of joy, ear to ear. And I was the very first person that that boy saw. And it was an incredible exchange of value in that I helped him go from a blind child to a sighted child, whereas he gave me an equally important gift. He gave me, at that moment, a very keen sense that I did matter and that my life had purpose. And I remember looking up and saying, basically, you see, I do matter. And kind of, when I was shouting at the wind, I didn't know how, but at that moment I did. And really from that transformative moment, right till to this day, I've been on this journey to figure out how to replicate that moment time and time again. Because I knew that if I could replicate that moment in many ways, small ways, I would be successful. No matter how many cars I had, or how many apartments I had, or how many suits I had, if I kept doing that work, I would be a successful person. So that sort of sent me on this mission. This pair of glasses represents another formative story in my exploration of starting VisionSpring. This time I was in Choco, Colombia, which is the western extent of Colombia. It's the poorest state in Colombia. 85% of the people are Choco Indian and about 15% of African descent from the slave trade. And we set up one of these temporary clinics, and 2 or 3 days into the clinic, this woman who apparently had canoed down the river 2 days to see us was in front of me. And she too was known as the blind lady. She too just needed a really strong pair of glasses. And we examined her eyes, we got her a pair of glasses, she could see again for the first time in 4 decades in an instant. And we were all very proud of ourselves. We slapped, high-fived ourselves, and another, saved person went back up the river. 2 days later, in the throes of another busy day, she came back and explained to us that when she got to her village, people laughed at her. She was dressed in traditional Indian, in the native Indian garb, and the only pair of glasses that we had that matched her prescription was in 1950s cat-eye glasses with rubies on it. And to be truthful, she did look kind of ridiculous. And we explained to her, your prescription is very unique. This was the only pair of frames that matched your prescription. And I'm sorry, we have nothing else for you. And then she did something that blew all of our minds. She took the glasses off her face, she put them on the table, she went back into her canoe, and she paddled upriver blind. And that was a very stark understanding that told me the important lesson that dignity and vanity are not monopolized by rich people. No matter how poor you are, you have a sense of dignity, you have a sense of culturally appropriateness and how you should look, and that's a very important feature. And so I started to question our model of taking donated frames that someone discarded and matching them up with another person. And I wanted to try to create a model that had more of a handshake aspect to it than a handout aspect to it. So let me just pause there for a second and ask people to give me examples or some ideas about the whole issue of the difference between a charity where there's a giver and a receiver versus a business relationship where there's a seller and a customer, or there's more of an equal footing that both parties need one another. If you have a business and you don't offer something that someone will buy, then you don't have much of a business. And so there's more of an equalness to that exchange. And to just ask people of other experiences that they may have had about maybe where a charity model was necessary or you could justify, or maybe another example of where a charity model fell short, and just sort of start to think about that component of why a charity and when versus why starting to think in a different way is appropriate. A wonderful example of a traditional business broadening its perspective in terms of seeding markets, innovative ways to approach new customers that at this point they're not able to get the same margin structure as they would from their core patients, but over time those patients will develop and will become customers. And so it's, if you will, an enlightened self-interest approach. And I think increasingly traditional for-profit businesses have to start to incorporate these innovative business models that reach into different sectors of society that frankly they've been ignoring because their margin structure just doesn't enable them to access those markets. So that's a wonderful example of how a traditional business can also reach deeper into the marketplace, both for the good of society as well as an enlightened self-interest approach, because doing well and doing good can certainly be in sync. Let me just tell one more story, and then I'll tell you kind of what we did and what our decision point was. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is sort of a classic story. And this man, his name is Chandramouli, and he was one of Ramadevi's customers. He was a 47-year-old tailor. He would make, on average, 20 saris a month. And he lived, a comfortable life. He supported his family. He went to work in a proud way. And he told this story to us that as he got into his early 40s, his up-close vision started to become compromised. And as you know, the detail on saris is quite spectacular. And the quality of his saris started to go down. And next thing you know, he was making 18 saris a month. And as his vision further faded and the quality went further down, his business went to 15 saris a month and ultimately to 10 saris a month when we met him, or when Ramadevi met him. He explained that he was just a couple of weeks away from closing his store. There was a lot of tension at home because economically there was a lot more pressure. And the worst thing of all in his mind was, again, that loss of dignity. He used to walk into his shop feeling good about who he was and what role he played in society. And by the end, because people the word was out that Chandramouli wasn't that good a tailor anymore, he would kind of go into his shop with his head down, sort of dejected. Ramadevi came in, did a quick screening for vision, realized that he just needed a pair of +3 reading glasses, sold them to him on the spot for, at that point, it was 170 rupees. Our glasses are less expensive now, most of them. And he told the story of being able to see again. The quality of his work in an instant went back to the golden days. And then he told us about his 18-month journey of building his business back from 10 to 20 saris. And after telling the story, he just shook his head and he said, and all because of the lack of a 170 rupee pair of glasses. And it really struck me that although this story had a really good ending, and we don't think about the lack of vision as an urgent problem, for him it was pretty darn urgent. If Ramadevi didn't come into that store that day or within a week or two, he would have lost his livelihood and he would have been breaking rocks on the side of the road for the rest of his life. And so every day that goes by where we don't distribute glasses to people who need them to see to work or see to learn, people are falling out of the workforce, families are affected, kids are falling out of school. Again, all for something that's so simple and so preventable. It's one of the largest forms of preventable disability in the world. 67% of visual impairment in your country is due to uncorrected refractive errors. 20% of blindness is due to uncorrected refractive errors. 60% of blindness is cataracts, 20% is uncorrected refractive error, and then 5 or 6% is glaucoma. So it's the second leading cause of blindness and the first leading cause of visual impairment. So let's go to the next slide. So the story continues where the vision entrepreneur model, we learned some incredible lessons. We learned that people would spend up to 10% of their income on a pair of glasses. We learned that people would buy glasses from a woman in their community as long as she had the proper training and the proper connection to the eye care system. We learned that they could prescribe the glasses appropriately and identify people who needed more advanced services to refer them forward. But as I was mentioning, we learned also that the business model didn't go around. And the fundamental reasons it didn't go around were severalfold. One was that although there was a physiological demand for our glasses, meaning people needed them to see, that demand wasn't, it was latent demand. It wasn't woken up. People didn't know that they needed glasses to see. So there was a lack of awareness of the problem. The people who needed the glasses and who we were trying to serve had very low capacity to pay, so there was not much of a margin opportunity. They were highly distributed. They tended to live in areas that were hard to reach, so therefore distribution costs were high. We had only one product, as Dr. Sethi mentioned, and so we couldn't distribute the earnings over a larger basket of goods. And so these were some of the factors that ended up working against us. So how did we solve the problem? And so we went to our next models. We call them our Vision 2.0 models. You can change it. So these were some of the lessons learned. Another one that I didn't mention was that we were more convinced than ever of the importance of having a market-based model. That we were convinced with this problem of, we estimate at least 700 million people need these glasses around the world. 400 million in India alone. And so that 700 million is probably a low estimate. And that no matter how much charity we were able to raise, we knew that it was never going to scale to the size of the problem. So we needed to get market forces to work. So we went to the next models. So you can change to the next. And let me explain to you a little bit about these models. One, as Shivi was saying, was the partnership model. The other is our proprietary distribution model, or what we call now our hub and spoke model. The partnership model took into consideration the fact that a lot of the reasons our other model didn't work was because the cost of distribution was high and the product offering was low. So we said, well, why couldn't we find other organizations that already has a distribution network? So we didn't have to identify, train, and manage our own sales force, and who are already selling similar products that matched with our product, and that we could place our product into that existing basket of goods. And so that's when we started to test that idea with an organization in Bangladesh called BRAC. So BRAC is a remarkable organization. It's actually the largest non-governmental organization in the world. It has a budget of almost $1 billion, $850 million this year, 2/3 of which is earned income. They're into everything. They're almost like a quasi-government in Bangladesh. Anyway, over their 40 years of existence, BRAC has created an army of community health workers. These are women who are in almost every community in Bangladesh who are selling simple products like oral rehydration salts, clean birthing kits, sanitary napkins, Band-Aids, aspirins, and so forth. So we said, well, why couldn't we just go and train them? And we tested that with 50 women. And it went very well, so we then tested it with 500 women. And that went well, and we tested it with 5,000 women. And then just a few months ago, we signed our next memorandum with BRAC to scale throughout the entire country of Bangladesh and train an additional 35,000 women over the next 3 years. And so we're going to basically be able to get reading glasses into every community in Bangladesh through our partnership with BRAC. We have partnerships in 20 countries now. We have hub and spoke in just 2 countries, El Salvador and India. As we mentioned, we're closing in on almost our 2 millionth person served. And in 2013 alone, we sold 500,000 pair of glasses. So we're starting to see this happening, and we believe it'll just kind of keep going. Actually, go to the next slide, because I think it's a little easier to see my point. If you look at, there are 2 lines there. There's a red line that runs on the bottom, which tells us the amount of philanthropic input we've taken in. And then the green line, which is our economic impact, which just reflects how many glasses we sold. Through our work with University of Michigan, we've seen that each pair of glasses yields about a $108 increase in income a year. And so you just multiply the 2. The point of the slide, though, is if you look over the last 5 years, our philanthropic input has doubled, but our impact has gone up 5-fold. And that's the beauty of a social enterprise. If you had a charity, most likely the 2 bars would go together. You know, philanthropic input equals delivery of service. Whereas as your economic engine starts to work in a social enterprise, you can start to build markets through sales, and more of your revenue comes in the form of sales revenue versus philanthropic revenue. And so that's those diverging lines are what social entrepreneurship is all about. And over time, the only reason you need philanthropic capital is to start new programs. It's not asking people for more money to do the same thing as you did last year. And that's what a charity does. And people kind of get fatigued with that. You asked me for $10,000 to do that last year, you're going to ask me $10,000 next year, whereas here we can say, well, give me $10,000 to start something in India, but then over time, India can take care of itself, so now give me $10,000 to start that same thing in Sri Lanka. And one other thing I would say about a social enterprise that's very important is the ability to measure impact. And one of the ways in which social enterprises have gotten a competitive advantage over typical charities is that as a general rule and as a group, we've been far better at measuring our impact and telling our impact story to the donor community and the investment community. Next slide. So looking forward, as an organization, we believe we can reach 10 million people over the next 10 years. And we're going to have 2 tracks. About a year ago, I stepped down from the CEO position of our organization. I'm still dedicating my time to this space and to my organization, but no longer running the organization on a daily basis. And I'm moving from building an enterprise to building a movement. And that's sort of the next chapter in social entrepreneurship. What you'll find is, because it's a relatively new field, the folks who got into it relatively early, 10, 12 years ago, like myself, there's this new cohort of social entrepreneurs who are moving away from building their enterprise and trying to figure out ways to build a movement around what they're doing by enacting policy and advocacy on a much larger basis. Because as someone was mentioning before, if you give a man a fish, you give him a fish. If you teach a man a fish, he can fish for the whole world. A social entrepreneur is someone who goes the next step, and we revolutionize the fishing industry. And that's what we're about. We're about revolutionizing industries and making changes that are core to policy and industries. This is our new model, or the model that I'm working on. In our old model, VisionSpring was at the center. And we worked with governments, and we worked with private companies, and we worked with foundations to solve a problem. But now we're putting the problem at the center, and we're getting this ecosystem of players to work with us around solving the problem on a global scale. And we're looking at ways to place vision issues more centrally on the economic development agenda.